Generally, when you hear talk about the IMF intervening in a country, you think of countries in distress, countries that seem far away, like Latin America and Southeast Asia in the 1998 crisis. But with the U.S. debt mounting, there has been concern the IMF could eventually knock on our door. Cramer was talking about it on street signs last week.
I believe the IMF will be here in 4 or 5 years if we don't get our act together. The IMF has had to do a lot of bailing out, and I don't want our country to be the place they go. So the answer is, yeah, if it means cutting Medicare, it means Social Security. I don't want the IMF here telling us what to do.
So how worried should we be about the IMF taking action? How much authority would they have? Would it be needed? Steve Leisman is at the Real-Time Exchange. Vince Reinhardt is resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, also the former Federal Reserve Board's Division of Monetary Affairs Director. Steve Leisman, let me start with you with your lovely clock. Could you explain, first of all, who funds and controls the IMF?
Well, member nations, Aaron, and of which the United States is the largest, and that's where the money comes from. So right now, the United States is not anywhere close to being on the receiving end of what you would call, say, an adjustment package, technical assistance package, some form of any one of the packages that they have. Although this debt clock is considerably rising, and whether or not for the adjustment process we will eventually need the IMF's assistance, I suppose is what's on the table here. I think we're a long way from it. When it comes to how the United States treats us, think about the IMF, which can be a saber-toothed tiger when it goes into different countries. There's a saber-toothed tiger right there, okay?
Those are some fangs.
Those are some fangs, right? And that it can be that way when it deals with certain countries. Right now, when it deals with the United States, it's probably better to transform the IMF into what would be like a puppy dog or something along those lines. That's more along the way it treats the United States right now. With kid gloves and with puppy eyes, that's right now. Whether or not Cramer's right 4 or 5 years from now, I think we're a very long way from that. I think Cramer's clock may be a little bit running a little fast there, but it could happen.
So there's lots of questions here, but Vince, first of all, just this logistical one. If we are the biggest funder of the IMF and we are the ones that are going bankrupt, wouldn't this not become a moot conversation?
There's other people who could pony up capital at the IMF, and in the event of severe market distress, they'd feel they'd have to. It's a mechanism for the other big countries to channel money to another country a little hands-off. They use the intermediation of the IMF. So, yeah, if the U.S. ran into problems, the IMF would come into action. But the main point where Cramer is right is if something is unsustainable, it has to stop. The fiscal path for the U.S. government is unsustainable. At some point, we have to change our policies, or the market will stop it for us in a crisis. Whether it's 4 or 5 years, like Cramer is saying, or further along, like Steve is saying, that's debatable. The problem is it usually doesn't come when it's convenient. It's the market forcing it upon you.
Vince, I don't want to be a doomsayer, but if we got to the point where we needed IMF-type help, would the world not be going down the toilet anyway?
Right.
There wouldn't be anyone left standing to help us.
So if we got to first of all, if we got to the point where the IMF, we needed to go to the IMF, it was because the market was no longer providing us funding and we needed additional liquidity. We would be facing what's called a sudden stop of credit. And the problem with a sudden stop, the very famous phrase, it's not the speed that kills you, it's the sudden stop. It would be a severe market distress. But there would be people with countries with deep pockets, including China, including India, including Germany. That's the problem with being a big debtor. At some point, you rely on the kindness of strangers.
Steve, what's your view on this? I mean, you could look at history, I guess, and go a lot of different ways, but you could say,
right.
To Mark's point, that you would see such deterioration in the world order that it would be chaos rather than someone stepping up.
That reminds me of the guys who were out there selling insurance on U.S. sovereign debt. Anybody who's buying that insurance, I think, is foolish. What they should be buying is cans of tuna fish, because if we're in that situation, I think Mark correctly points out, look, we know a couple things. We know the rules are different for the world's reserve currency. We can do this for a while. This is not the end of the world. We're about 100% of GDP. I think people make a little bit more of it than they should. I think there are reasons why the deficit is much higher than it would be right now if not for the economy. The discussion we have to have is one that separates the cyclical from the structural. If we have a built-in deficit that's greater than our growth potential here, then we have a serious problem. And everybody is sort of coming to that conclusion that we do. It doesn't have to be solved tomorrow. And what's interesting here is the difference really between Obama and the Ryan plan is 10 years versus 12 years. I don't think either one matters a whole lot for the market. I think if you told the market, we'll solve this in a decade or 12 years, but you'll really solve it, that'll be enough.
But the point, Steve, is you have to start. It isn't like you
That's
can
right.
solve. You can't solve.
Can't keep going up and up forever here.
So the issue is, in the next couple years, market participants have to be convinced that we got a plan. So the plan might not balance things for 12 years, but in 2 or 3 years, they got to be reassured.
I agree.
Okay. We can't afford to let you talk anymore because, that clock has gone up $8 million just in the time we had you guys talk.